I was 14 at the time, and like any kid that age, I was always curious about everything around me. That afternoon, while walking home from school, I passed by the city park and noticed something different. A circus had set up there, with a colorful tent and lively music filling the air. I was excited. Circuses were rare in my town, and I knew I had to check out the show. Without thinking twice, I went to the entrance, where a smiling man with a funny hat was handing out tickets. "Come on in, kid. You're gonna love it," he said, and I, without hesitation, took the ticket with a smile. I walked into the tent, my heart racing with anticipation. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and full of life. Kids were laughing and having a great time, and I took a seat in the front row, eager to see what would happen next. The show started with acrobats and jugglers, but the best part was when the clown took the stage. He was the typical clown face, painted white, colorful hair, oversized clothes, and a big red nose. He was hilarious, deliberately tripping and making jokes that had everyone around me roaring with laughter, including me. At one point, he came over to where I was sitting and, with that big smile, made a joke with me. "Hey, big guy, give me a hand here," he said, tossing me a colorful ball. I caught it, a little awkwardly, and he exclaimed, "Nice catch. Now you're part of the show." Everyone laughed, and I felt special for being picked. But then, something strange happened. Just as the show was about to end, the clown's nose fell off. Everyone thought it was part of the act and laughed even harder. I laughed too, but for a brief moment I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. The clown, who had been laughing along with the audience, suddenly stopped smiling. His eyes, which had been full of humor, narrowed, and for a split second, he seemed angry. It only lasted a moment, but it was enough to stick in my mind. Then, he quickly snapped back, forcing a smile and saying, "Looks like I'll have to go find my lost nose." He tried to play it off lightly, but that odd moment lingered in my thoughts. While everyone kept laughing, I glanced at the ground and saw the clown's red nose rolling until it stopped near me. Nobody seemed to notice, so, driven by a teenager's curiosity, I bent down and picked up the nose, slipping it into my pocket. I thought it would be funny to keep it and show my friends later. At the time, it seemed like a harmless prank, nothing more. After the show, I started walking back home with the clown's nose in my pocket. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange, and I was still chuckling at the clown's jokes. But suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine, like someone was watching me. I tried to brush off the feeling and kept walking, but then I heard a faint sound. Almost imperceptibly, was a muffled giggle, like someone quietly laughing behind me. I quickly turned around, expecting to see some kid playing, but all I saw was the empty street. The houses around me were silent, and I stood there for a moment, trying to hear it again, but the sound was gone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling, and kept walking, convincing myself it was just a kid nearby, or maybe just my imagination. When I got home, everything felt normal again. I put the clown's nose in the drawer of my nightstand, thinking about how funny it would be to show it to my friends at school the next day. I had dinner with my parents, did my homework, and went to bed. The memory of the clown and that brief, strange expression crossed my mind, but I quickly forgot about it. To me, it had just been a fun afternoon. But that night, something woke me up. In the middle of the darkness, I suddenly awoke, my heart racing. I was disoriented for a moment, trying to figure out what had happened when I heard it. That same muffled giggle, faint, like a whisper in the dark, cut through the silence of my room. I froze. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. I thought about getting up, running to my parents' room, but I couldn't move a muscle, paralyzed by fear. I just lay there, completely still, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark, waiting for something else to happen. When the sun finally came up, bringing a pale light into the room, I felt some relief. I got out of bed, exhausted, my eyelids heavy. At school, I could barely focus on my classes. The exhaustion weighed on me, and the events of the previous night wouldn't leave my mind. That night terrified me so much that I decided I had to get rid of that nose, no matter what. The next morning, I put the nose in my pocket, trying to stay calm despite my fear. As I walked to school, I felt that strange sensation again. It was like someone was watching me. That feeling had my nerves on edge. As I turned a corner, for a split second, I saw him. The clown was there, standing on the corner, staring right at me. His eyes seemed to pierce through my soul, and terror took hold of me. I blinked, and he was gone, like he was never there. Without thinking, I pulled the nose out of my pocket and, with all my strength, threw it exactly where I had seen the clown. Instantly, I heard those horrible giggles again, echoing all around me, as if he was everywhere at once. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back, my heart pounding and my legs nearly giving out from the fear. When I finally got home, I locked myself in my room, out of breath and trembling. I waited, but nothing happened. After that day, I never saw the clown again. He just disappeared from my life as mysteriously as he had appeared. But what haunts me to this day is the question I can't answer. Was that thing really human? Or was it something much worse? Something I should never have encountered? That doubt stays with me, even on the brightest, sunniest days. I don't think about the past much, but there are those things that you just can't forget no matter how much you try. When my parents died in a vehicle crash, I was 12. The ground opened up and swallowed me. After their death, I went to live with my maternal grandparents in Louisiana. They were good people. They always gave me all the love they could, but none could replace the gap my parents left. My grandparents lived in a small town house, the kind in which everyone knows everybody. And this is a quiet place, I must say, but within that neighborhood, there seemed to be some figure who always intrigued me. Mrs. Mabel. She lived in that old house, further up the street than the rest of the houses, and was hardly ever seen. My grandparents would say that since her husband died, she became reclusive, almost a shadow in the neighborhood. The only company she had was from a young caregiver called Laura, who always came and left from the house. Laura was 20, and I was 16 at that time. This girl was different from the others who surrounded me. Each time she passed our house, she would stop and chat with me. We would talk about simple things, just like how was your day, or what do you like to do. Laura was friendly, smiled, and in a short time, she became a real friend of mine. I met Laura sometimes when I went to Mrs. Mabel's house. On such days, Mrs. Mabel always had a few words for me, even if they were a few. She was an inquisitive kind of woman, with an almost strange way of speaking. When she came across me, she always repeated, "Hey, hey, youth. It's our greatest treasure," as if it was some kind of tick. She let her head tip to the side and her eyes for a second to roll upwards. It always kind of made me feel strange, yet I tried to just ignore it. As time went by, Laura started pouring out her misgivings to me. She got a suspicion that Mrs. Mabel was into black magic and voodoo. "Ryan, something is very unusual in that house," she would say. "I found used candles, bones, things which appear to come from a kind of ritual. It's scaring me." I listened attentively to everything, but just wanted to comfort her. "Maybe it's only a superstition, Laura. These things are normal in Louisiana." Deep inside, however, it began to worry me. Mrs. Mabel, with her enigmatic way and those tics, didn't seem so harmless as I'd like to believe. Over time, my relationship with Laura became something I could not do without. She was one of those rare people who really seemed to understand how I felt. Whenever she walked in front of my grandparents' house, Laura always managed to find her way up the walk to talk with me. We might stay in the yard, or maybe I would go up to Mrs. Mabel's house, where Laura seemed to spend most of her time. She was always there whenever I happened to pass by, actually, at her house. She never talked much, but the few times she did, it was always the same.
Hey, youth. It's really our best treasure too."
And then that annoying tic would show itself. She'd tilt her neck to the side and roll her eyes upward. I tried not to make a big deal of this, but it always made me a little uneasy. It was like there was something swimming behind her words, and it was all elusive to me. Laura, on the other hand, was getting increasingly concerned. She would call and tell me about the weird stuff she found in the attic. Consumed candles, and bones appearing as if some sort of ritual was going on. "Ryan, I'm certain Mrs. Mabel is involved in black magic," she would say. "And the strangest thing is, she seems to know things about me that I never told her." I tried to reassure Laura, but with every visit to that house, it was getting hard to disregard what she informed me. With every visit to that house, this feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. Had Laura been right in suspecting something? I didn't know, but the feeling started creeping in that there was more about that house than met my human eye. Things had changed, but very subtly and yet so clearly. Laura suddenly stopped coming to my grandparents. I thought she might be busy, perhaps with more workload, but with the days passing into weeks, I started to get concerned. She wasn't messaging either, and I wondered what was wrong. It was as though she had disappeared into my life overnight and didn't leave any sign. One day, unable to hide my uneasiness any longer, I asked my grandmother if she knew anything. "Grandma, have you seen Laura? It's been days since she last came by." My grandmother sighed before answering, with an expression that told me bad news was to follow. "Ryan, didn't you hear? Mrs. Mabel passed away a few days ago. It all happened very quickly. Laura is still at the house, but she's packing her bags to leave." That caught me by surprise, and weird feelings entrapped me. Laura had never told me that Mrs. Mabel was so ill, let alone that she had died and now she was leaving. We shared everything, always. Why hadn't she said anything? As soon as my mind filled with that question, I resolved to go to the house where Mrs. Mabel lived to bid farewell to Laura. So I knocked on the door, my heart pounding, hoping everything was okay. When Laura opened the door, from the very second I laid eyes on her, a shiver ran down my spine. She was there, but something felt very different. Her smile appeared unrealistic, almost like a mask. The warmth she always carried was distant and cold now. I tried to start a conversation, but Laura answered in short sentences, as if she wanted to get rid of me. "Hey, Laura. I heard Mrs. Mabel died. How are you holding up?" I asked, trying to feign concern. I could feel the tension in the air, and trying to understand a bit more about what happened. I asked, but was Mrs. Mabel really that old? I mean, I didn't expect her to go so fast. Laura did not say anything for a while, as if weighing the reply. Then, with an unreadable smile which sent a shiver down my spine, she said,
Yes, Ryan. She was old. A youth.
"It's our greatest treasure." And, before I knew it, she cocked her neck to one side and rolled her eyes upward, just like Mrs. Mabel used to do every time she said that irritating catchphrase. It came upon me like a blow. I was paralyzed, unable to believe my eyes. It wasn't what she said, but precisely the way she did it. The same movement I had seen 1,000 times in Mrs. Mabel. For 1 second, it was as if I was again in front of her. And he was Laura, who repeated those gestures as if they were natural. My mind was racing. I remembered how many times Mrs. Mabel had said those words, always at those moments when she seemed to yearn for something lost. And now, with Laura repeating that gesture, that expression, it was as though Mrs. Mabel herself were there. Some way, something of her having remained. I tried to find the words, but my voice failed. "Laura, are you okay?" I asked once more, this time with more than evident concern. She smiled in a strange way, as if she was lost in her thoughts.
Yes, Ryan. I'm fine. Actually, I feel very good, like I haven't in a long time.
That incomprehensible smile struck me as all the more uneasier. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Saying a hasty farewell, I left. But from my mind's eye, Laura repeating that gesture, that phrase, would just not go away. What did I just see? The Laura I knew was gone, it seemed. What remained was a shadow, something terrifying and confusing me. Something was sinister, and I felt an increasing confirmation that it wasn't my imagination at all. Days were passing, and the feeling of discomfort was just growing. I didn't hear anything from Laura. Each time the phone rang, I hoped it was her, but the silence continued. I tried not to brood over it too much, but the shadow of what I had seen at the house of Mrs. Mabel followed me everywhere. I sat at the table one day, and my grandmother entered the kitchen and sat beside me. She was deep in thought. After a few seconds of silence, she finally asked, "Ryan, has Laura sent you any messages? Do you know what happened to her?" I shook my head, with a voided feeling in my chest. "No, Grandma. Since she left, we haven't spoken." My grandma sighed, as if considering something that she did not know how to say. "You know, Ryan, Mrs. Mabel must have really liked Laura, like she was her own daughter. I heard she left an insurance policy for Laura, with a considerable amount." My mind was racing. Those words brought back all the unease I had been trying to suppress. Why would Mrs. Mabel leave such a sum to Laura? What really happened in this house? The pieces started fitting together in a macabre way. Even before I could think of the answer, Mrs. Mabel and her obsession with youth. And that ever-echoing phrase, "a youth." It's our greatest treasure. And here comes Laura, now missing, after acting so bizarrely and carrying the same tics. What came to my mind was too terrifying to be true, but at the same time, it seemed to be the only explanation that was possible. Mrs. Mabel hadn't left an inheritance for Laura. She had left herself. Somehow, that ritual, that voodoo that Laura was afraid of, allowed Mrs. Mabel to trade in her old frail body for Laura's youth and vitality by taking over the young caregiver's body. I never heard from Laura again, and her silence only confirmed what I had feared. Her half-promise had been only that. The woman now living with Laura's features was no longer she herself. Mrs. Mabel had found a way to continue, but not at the cost of growing old herself.